So this session is on canon law and marriage and the RCIA, basically. But we'll talk about all kinds of marriage questions and any other baptismal questions or things like that. There was an earlier session on canon law that some of you might have gone to from Janine Marino, and I'm sure that was very helpful. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about is, and you, I'm sure, experience this all the time in the parishes. People come in and they're all excited about becoming Catholic, and then all of a sudden they tell you they have a former marriage and everything gets deflated. And that's especially true for non-Catholics who just don't understand what we're doing, and many Catholics don't understand what we're doing. And so I think it's important to recognize that right up front and try to be as welcoming and as kind and understanding with the people as you can be, that you're happy that they want to learn more about the faith and get closer to Jesus. There are a few maybe obstacles, but that you're willing to help them, as opposed to being negative and saying, oh, you can't come in, there are rules in the church. Try to be as pastoral as you can and try to encourage your pastor and your associate pastor to do the same thing, so that we're welcoming people and then trying to work through getting their problems solved. In many cases, they can be solved, and it's really just a matter of either going through the process or finding out that they have a situation that doesn't need a big process. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. The first thing are these inquirer information forms, which you have in your packet. And you may have seen them before. Several of you say that you've used them before. So I just want to go through them with you to raise questions. And when you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand and ask them. So the reason why we do all of this, and it means, especially with marriage, as you know, is because of how importantly we treat marriage, and we do that because of the way Jesus taught. And he was pretty emphatic about saying that when the two become one, that they should not be divided or separated. But he did make provision for certain cases. And also that we respect other people and other people's faiths. And so it's important to try to help people to understand that it's not simply that we're trying to just follow rules and regulations, but that it's really out of love and concern for married couples and the importance of that sacrament, and also out of respect for other faiths. So two non-Catholics who get married on the beach, we consider that a valid marriage because they're not bound by our rules, our laws. But a Catholic who does the same without permission, it's invalid. So it can, again, get confusing. And always the bottom line is, if you have a question, to call the office. Right. Yeah. Oh, you want to be here? Okay. And, yeah, that's fine. Thank you. There you go. Thank you. So let's go through the form first. The inquirer information form, we'll just take a look and go through. Has all kinds of information there, just general information, contact information, then religious history. And so you'd ask the person what their current religious affiliation is. Have you ever been baptized? Okay, if they say yes, you have to ask for more and get a copy of the baptismal certificate, and I'll tell you why that's important. Oh, I'm sorry. Here you go.
Thanks.
Sure, sorry about that. Okay. So that some people, the Catholic Church does not recognize as valid all baptisms. There are certain ones that we recognize as valid. Most mainline Protestant churches, Episcopal, Anglican, Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, those are generally considered valid in the Catholic Church. Mormon baptism, we do not consider a valid baptism. So if somebody says they've been baptized in the Mormon Church, we consider them unbaptized. Okay? So if you have a question about that, ask your pastor or call the office, the tribunal office, and they can help you to determine. And even some of the ones that we consider valid, in a particular instance, it might not have been valid if they don't use the proper words. Even a Catholic baptism, if it's not done in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, is invalid, even if a priest or deacon does it. There were times when they would baptize in the name of the Creator and the Sanctifier and the Savior, and that is an invalid baptism. And so sometimes we have to look into it or call the church and say, how do you baptize? Sometimes on a Protestant baptismal certificate it'll say, Joe Smith was baptized in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, then you know that that's a valid baptism. So it's important to know if the person's been baptized and where, and also to get a copy of the baptismal certificate. And that also makes a difference for the Eastern Rite churches, the Orthodox churches, because some of them, most of them, give all three sacraments of initiation at baptism. Some don't. And so if someone has already received baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist, you don't confirm again. You can have them part of your class in some other way, but you would not confirm. That's not repeatable. Okay? If there's a doubt about baptism, genuine doubt, you can conditionally baptize a person. And oftentimes people will come and they're sure that they were baptized, but they don't have the forms. Or because of war or other things in certain parts of the world, the church has been destroyed and they can't get a record today. Now, if they're certain and a parent comes in and a godparent comes in and says, I know this happened, they show you pictures of when it happened, you can recreate that record in your own records for them so that they can always come back to your church. And you can say, our records indicate that so-and-so was baptized in El Salvador, and even if you don't have an exact date, in April 1979, and then receive First Communion and confirmation here. So you're free to, you can do that. And again, if you have a question, call the office and we'll help you through it. A lot of times people don't have. Now, if you don't have that much information, or if the person says, I think I was baptized, I'm not really sure, it's best to conditionally baptize and start the record from there in your own parish, so that they, when they are ready to go on for marriage or something else, they have a record. Okay? So baptism, and you see there in what denomination, date, place, and all of that. And then if they were baptized Catholic, check the sacraments they've already received, if they have. Because oftentimes in the RCIA, you have Catholics who need to complete their initiation, right? They've already been baptized, but they haven't received First Communion or confirmation, right?
What happened if the people was baptized long time ago in another religion, and now they don't have a record document for the country?
Right, then it would conditionally baptize. Do a conditional the priest or deacon can conditionally baptize right now, and then the record starts from that day.
Oh, okay.
That's,
Even if, if it knows, let's say on the Baptist church, they baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but they don't have the record.
Yes, there are a lot of Protestant churches that say they don't have a record.
right. If the family has a record, a letter, or if they can prove it somehow, oftentimes in baptism, they're baptized as adults. So the person himself or herself would know they were baptized when they were 16, 17, 18. If they know they were baptized, try to recreate the record as much as you can. If there's any doubt, conditionally baptize. It's better because all of the other sacraments have no effect if you're not baptized. That's the thing. Baptism is the entryway into all of the sacraments. So if there's any doubt about that, moving forward, the person receiving confession, communion, marriage, anointing, none of it has effect for someone who is not baptized. So it's very important. You want to make sure. And that's why, if there's any doubt at all about the person's baptism, conditionally baptize and start from there, and you're fine. Okay, that's good. Thank you. All right, so now on the next page, we get into the marital status. And you have all of the different things there. And the easiest, of course, I'm single, I've never been married before. Now, you know that when you ask that question, oftentimes the first answer you get is not the final answer. And we have this with marriages, on the week before the wedding is going to take place. Well, I was married in Las Vegas, but I didn't think that counted. It counts. You have to know everything. And when I bring couples in to prepare them for marriage, I ask really 4 or 5 times. Did you ever get married in a drunken stupor at a wedding chapel in Las Vegas? Any type of marriage at all. You need to know, because it could be a valid marriage that needs an annulment. And so it's important to emphasize that to people. You don't want to get to the week before the Easter Vigil and then say, I'm sorry, I we can't bring you into the church because you have a prior marriage that you didn't tell us about. For non-Catholics, that makes a big difference because what's valid for a non-Catholic or what's invalid for a Catholic might be valid for a non-Catholic, and we'll go through those. So when you get to this page, it's important to ask these questions. Some may just be engaged to be married, fine. Some might be married already, that's fine. And you ask the questions. And then also, now if they're already married, right, so you say it's a non-Catholic who wants to come into the church. They come to you and they say they're married, fine. What about their spouse? What religion is their spouse? Has that spouse ever been married before? Okay, because that could be an invalid marriage because of the marital status of the spouse. Okay? Most of the time, the people who come in are married to Catholics, and that's why they're coming into the church. That's a wonderful thing. So you just want to check on that first, on their current marriage. Does the spouse have a prior marriage? Okay? And this is pretty clear here. It asks all those questions. And then married but separated, divorced, have not remarried, widow, widower. And then the list of other family information. So now we are on current marital status follow-up. And then again, we tried to be as clear as possible to say, well, if this is what they say they are, then these are the things you want to ask about. So I'm engaged to be married. If either of the inquirer, the person coming in, or the inquirer's fiancé has been previously married, complete sections 5 and 6 on the previous marriage information form, which is right behind this. Okay? And that's to make sure there's not a previous marriage. And again, emphasize to them it's important to know everything. Okay? So while we're here, it's important to know a Catholic, all Catholics are required to follow our law regarding marriage. Anyone who's not a Catholic is required to follow our law if he or she is marrying a Catholic. Okay? And there's all kinds of rules and regulations about getting married. So if a Catholic gets married outside of the church without permission, you have to ask about that because there's ways that a Catholic can get permission to be married by an Anglican priest in a hotel. Okay? So that could be valid. Just because a Catholic does that doesn't mean it's invalid. But in general, if a Catholic gets married without permission in a non-Catholic church or by a justice of the peace, that is invalid. And I'm going to go through a form with you that's different than a full annulment. If it's invalid, we just have to declare it invalid on the paper. You have to have some documents, but just on the paper because it was never valid, because the Catholic didn't follow the rules regarding permission to get married. But as I say, there are permissions. For a Catholic to marry a baptized non-Catholic, that's permission for mixed religion, right? And then a Catholic to marry an unbaptized person. That's a dispensation for disparity of cult. And your pastor and the priest in the parish should know all of these things. But that makes a difference too, because a permission is not as strong as a dispensation. If you marry without a permission, it's against the law, but it's valid. If you marry without a dispensation, not only is it against the law, but it's invalid. So that's a distinction and that's something that the tribunal looks at and figures out and helps you to find out. So I know it's a lot of things. We'll go slow and you'll have time for questions afterwards. So these are basically the follow-up things there. People coming into the program, I mean, usually our programs start in the fall, September, with an expectation that they will come into the church in April or at the Easter Vigil. So if you ask these questions in September and there is a problem with marriage, bring it to the tribunal right away. We make every effort to try to get it done by the Easter Vigil, but we can't promise because of the workload and also because of how much they work with us, the people who are submitting the application. So the next one there, if the inquirer responds, I am married, again, follow to section 6, to the previous marriage information, find out the information. Have they been married before? Has their spouse been married before? Is the spouse Catholic? Is the spouse baptized? All of those things. And you see that then on the next page. If the inquirer responds, I am married, was your spouse baptized Catholic? Was your marriage witnessed by a Catholic priest or deacon? Did you receive a dispensation or have someone other than a Catholic priest? So those are the questions that basically come up with marriage. If the inquirer responds, I'm divorced and not remarried, then you want to, is your previous spouse alive? And if the person is simply divorced and not remarried, that person is free to be received into the full communion of the Catholic Church. That's not an impediment. The impediment is the second marriage after the divorce, okay? But you have to make sure they know if they're received, they can't get married in the Catholic Church without that first marriage being looked at for an annulment. If the former spouse has died, then they're not bound by that union, okay? And of course, the complicated one is, if a person is divorced and remarried now, then you can welcome them into the program, but say that they have to have that first marriage looked at before they could be received into full communion. Okay. And then you see there on the next section the previous marriage information. And you just ask some more questions just to kind of get more information there. Former spouse's current name. Has your former spouse ever been baptized? Again, it's important because it has different ramifications in the law if the person is baptized or not. Date of marriage, type of marriage ceremony. And it's good to ask if the former spouse has already petitioned. Sometimes the person doesn't know. They should know, they should be informed, but sometimes things fall through the cracks and they're not informed. But we can look at where the former spouse lives. We could check with the tribunal there. Has this person sent in a case? Things like that. We do find out sometimes after the fact that the marriage has been annulled by the former spouse, and so now this spouse is free to come into the church. Okay. And then the same thing for a first, second marriage. And then the other is for first and second marriage for the spouse, the former spouse. Okay. So any questions about that? I know it can be a little confusing. And then what I'll do now is just talk a little bit about the annulment process. In your packet, you have these little cards that we've sent to every parish, and if you need them, you can, or the pastor can ask for some more from the chancery. We have these available in English and Spanish, just to put out on the rack in the back of church and let people, if they have questions, this is a nice little card to answer some of the questions. And just for your own information, on the back of the card, it says, how long does the process take? The average case takes 6 months. Well, in the best of circumstances. Normally we say a year, that it would take a year. And we do not charge any fee at all for annulments. That was done away with by Cardinal Wuerl a few years ago when Pope Francis asked every diocese to make it easier for people to apply and not to put up the barrier of having them pay for it. And so we do not charge any fee and don't expect any donation for annulments. Okay? So there's some more of these cards you're welcome to take with you. All right, before we get to the annulment stuff, just a little, another question about Catholics who want to marry baptized non-Catholics who are coming in, catechumens, right? Okay, so say you have a catechumen is coming into the church, is already married to a Catholic person, that's fine. If he's married to a Catholic person, as long as that was done in a Catholic church or with permission for a non-Catholic wedding, it's valid. If not, say they just got married civilly, and now the non-baptized wants to become Catholic. He or she can be received into the church, and they can be married. They can be married beforehand, and if they're married beforehand, you need a dispensation for the Catholic to marry the non-Catholic. Okay? If you receive the person, say, it's not enough time for them to prepare, they have family out of country that are going to come and visit, You can do the marriage after the person is received. And as I was saying before,
You said 2 or 3 weeks, is that hard and fast?
no. Now, some priests will be more a stickler about that. In the Archdiocese, we do not require that you be married. Now, the reason for that, well, why they would be sticklers, technically, we should not be receiving people into to the full communion of the church, and then all of a sudden they're now in an invalid marriage. So you would try to explain to them the importance of being married as either before, that would be the preference, to do the wedding before they come into the church, but if that's not practical, to allow them to do it afterwards as soon as possible, and during that time they should remember that they are not married in the church, and so they should live in such a way that they respect each other until they're married.
The question of being married before the baptism, I've heard that for the marriage to be a sacrament, the other person has to be baptized.
Right. Now, so when they're married before,
Right.
it's not a sacramental marriage, it's a valid marriage. As soon as the unbaptized is baptized, it becomes a sacrament,
Correct.
without any other.
But if they're married civilly, the minute the unbaptized person is baptized,
Well, not for a Catholic, because the civil marriage was invalid. But if you have two unbaptized people who get,
that's
or,
that.
well, but how about, if you have an unbaptized married to a baptized non-Catholic, Protestant.
Right.
The unbaptized wants to become Catholic. They're already civilly married, that's a valid marriage. Once the unbaptized is baptized, that marriage is a sacrament, because it's a baptized non-Catholic. You still don't have to do anything to validate that marriage. They may want to be married in the church, and you can do a ceremony, a blessing of vows, renewal of vows, that kind of thing, but it's not required.
But then they can't be sponsors if they're not married, no?
I'm sorry?
They can't be sponsors if they're not married by the church.
No. Well, only Catholics can be only Catholics can be sponsors.
That's what I'm saying, if they're not married in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, that would complicate it. They might have to have somebody else to be a sponsor.
Yeah, so they
Right.
would have to
Right.
get the,
Yeah. All right, marriage of a catechumen and a baptized non-Catholic. As I said, so any couples who are married, who are not Catholic, and they're married, we consider those marriages to be valid, basically. If you have an Orthodox Christian, they are non-Catholic. Right? There are Catholic Eastern Rite churches. For every Orthodox church, there is a Catholic alternative, if you will. So there's Russian Orthodox, Russian Catholic, Ukrainian Orthodox, Ukrainian Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Greek Catholic, okay, Maronite, Coptic Christians. So, but for the Orthodox, who are not in union with us, those marriages, that's a non-Catholic, baptized non-Catholic. But if they have gotten married without a priest or deacon from their own church there, we consider that invalid, because they have to follow the form of their marriage. Okay? So that's just a little thing to kind of keep in mind. Oftentimes if you get a Orthodox who's been married before, but they didn't get married in their church, we can declare that null without a formal, full process, annulment process. Okay?
I know you're trying to ask all the questions so we can, follow up, but I have the feeling there are other questions that are not on here, and so we need to pursue it.
Yeah, exactly. And when you have a question, give a call.
Pursue it with the tribunal.
Right. Give a call to the office. We get all kinds of.
Right,
Yeah, you can't think of everything here, but you've seen lots of things, I bet, in your parishes, and so you can bring them up, here as we go along. All right.
Monsignor?
Yes.
What about arranged marriages from other countries coming here and taking it to the church?
Right. Just because a marriage is arranged doesn't mean it's invalid. If either party to it does not consent, then it's a problem. But arranged, as long as they consent and there's no duress, they're not being forced to do it, that's okay. So the priest would have to sit with the couple and ask them some questions, make sure that they're doing this on their own, freedom, with their own freedom. Okay.
If a marriage is done, let's say she was pregnant before getting married, and she didn't want to get married yet, but the parents says you have to.
That could be duress, that could be force and fear. And that's why, again, the priest is supposed to sit down with the couple without the parents and say, do you want to get married? You should not get married if the only reason is because you're pregnant. But that's not just by itself. You really should be giving yourself totally and entirely, which people can do. That's why they got pregnant, because they love each other and want to be a couple and want to be a family. Then that's fine. But if the
that were like hidden, like no tell. Like she didn't say anything about she was pregnant.
He says.
Oh, I'm not following. But if she says she doesn't tell the priest that she was pregnant, or the man she's.
Let's say she didn't tell the priest that she was pregnant.
Yeah. Again, after the fact, if that marriage should break up, the tribunal would look at that and say, okay, was that the reason why they got married? So it would be something they would look at. But the presumption is when they get married, it's valid. Right? Yeah. There's all kinds of marriage cases. People who get married to make a person a citizen of the country, and that's the only reason. Or people get married for health insurance purposes or things like that. Bless you. Those are invalid if they're not getting married to stay together for life. Yeah. And then so that would go to the annulment case. That would make it easier in those cases to declare it null.
I think if the mother is pushing the daughter to get married, and they get married, the girl doesn't want to get married if she's pregnant. She said, no, you don't get married if you're pregnant. That would become valid.
Yeah, I think it would be an invalid marriage. Yeah. But if they get married, it would still have to go to a tribunal if they get married in the church. If they just get married civilly and the person is Catholic, it's invalid.
If the person got married, but a few years later, she runs out with someone else.
Right. Because the tribunal will look at that and say, well, at the time, you did not consent to this marriage. You did it under duress because you were pregnant, you were being pressured by your parents, and you thought you had no other way out. Then they would probably declare that null or give an annulment in that case.
There is no love.
Right. And now it doesn't mean that it started out that way and then after a few years they fall in love and they are together for 40 years. Then that becomes a valid marriage.
But it did not.
Yeah, sure, it could be.
That way they separated because she.
Yeah, no, right, exactly. If the person, right,
Doesn't love.
right.
There is no love during the marriage.
The actual, right, if there's no consent at that point, it's invalid. But you can give consent later on, is my point.
But later on, it can be
You
given
can,
without reputation of marriage.
correct. Yeah. And again, that's something the tribunal would look at. And say at the time of the marriage, they look at what happened at the time of the marriage and then what followed. But if there was duress or... I'm sorry, you can do... Sure, yeah, or a renewal of vows, absolutely, yeah. Good. How are you? All right, well now let's go through, just want to talk about the annulment process a little bit more, and there are some things in your packet. The first one that I'd like to talk about is the petition for a declaration of nullity, lack of canonical form. It's just one sheet, and this was again redone. It's on the website in English and Spanish, and there's nice explanations on the back, so that's pretty good. Sorry. Sure. Okay, so this is what the priest will use when he meets with, so if you identify in your RCIA program someone who has difficult marriage, an irregular marriage, then you tell them that they need to go talk to the pastor or associate pastor to go through, and the pastor might ask you to fill out this form with them. And it's important for these forms and any of the marriage forms that you fill it out while you ask the questions. You don't just give this to the person and have them fill it out, okay? Because you should make yourself familiar with it and ask the right questions. And sometimes, you'd be surprised, people don't always tell the truth, shockingly, which is why we have confession. So you want to make sure. We have found cases where people have given wrong information or doctored records, which is why we insist on having original records, because people can make changes to the records. And I mean, it's foolish because they're only hurting themselves, but so it's important that you ask the questions or the priest asks the questions, okay? So this is the form that would be used for a Catholic who marries someone else, another Catholic or a non-Catholic, outside of the church. You can have two Catholics who go to the courthouse and get married civilly, okay? But they didn't get permission from the church, and that marriage is invalid. If a Catholic marries a non-Catholic, baptized non-Catholic in a Presbyterian church or a Baptist church without permission, it's invalid, okay? Catholics can get permission to marry outside the church. And that is a separate form that the priest would fill out with them to get the information, and it's sent to our office, and we grant the permission on a regular basis for a Catholic to get married in an Episcopal church or a Presbyterian or Methodist or Lutheran, that kind of thing. We are also permitting on a case-by-case basis here in the Archdiocese of Washington weddings to be performed outdoors. And we've never done that before. That's a sort of a change in policy. And again, that's on a case-by-case. And if a couple wants that, we ask that the priest or deacon who is working with them send a letter into my office to request that and the reasons for it. Okay? Baltimore is doing the same right now, Archdiocese of Baltimore. We're finding some of our younger Catholics have different view of marriage, and instead of just sweeping them aside or not keeping them in the church, we're trying to accommodate them as best we can. Okay.
What about if they're married by a renter priest?
Yeah, anything that's not,
Okay.
if for a Catholic, it has to be a priest or deacon of the Catholic Church, or permission for something else.
Well, no, he was a priest. He's no longer a priest.
Yeah, no. The fact of being a priest is not the thing. You have to have jurisdiction.
Yes.
So if I go across to Arlington and do a wedding without permission, it's invalid, even for two Catholics. So it's a matter of jurisdiction. You have to have the permission of the bishop to do a marriage in some place other than your own diocese. Yeah, in this diocese, I'm sorry? You're supposed to get permission, but I think it would still be valid. For weddings, it would be invalid. Right? Yeah, baptism, because it's the entryway, the church, a non-Catholic doctor can baptize a child, and that's a valid baptism. But for marriage, you have to have, and for confession, if you don't have permission, either by the law itself or by the bishop, to hear confession, it's invalid.
So there's a parishioner here. She doesn't want to get married to the parish. So she was in parish with the priest to go to another parish for a few months until they recognize the marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And after that we went back.
Yeah, that's okay. You can get married outside of your parish.
Yeah, she went
Right.
back to the parish.
Right. That, yeah, for the person,
Just for the-
the jurisdiction really is for the priest or deacon who is witnessing the marriage. Okay. So in order to be a valid witness, you have to have permission or delegation from the pastor. So if you have, a lot of times you have weddings in your parish and the bride or groom is bringing a friend in or an uncle from someplace else, that person has to have the permission of the pastor, and we ask for a letter of suitability to make sure that he's in good standing in his own diocese. And in some jurisdictions, you have to be registered with the city or state. So in DC, We have to register with the DC government before we can perform marriages. Once you register once, you're registered for life. In Maryland, you do not need to register. The priest or deacon.
Example of illicit but valid.
Marriage?
Yeah, yes.
If a priest or deacon does a marriage without getting a permission for mixed religion, so a Catholic is marrying a baptized non-Catholic, and the priest or deacon fails to get permission and goes ahead and does the marriage anyway, it's valid but illicit. And in fact, that might not, the law does permit that in certain circumstances, so it wouldn't even be illicit. I'd have to think more about that. Okay. So this declaration of nullity is, I just want to emphasize that it's different than a full annulment process. This takes about a month for us just to look into, make sure that the information is correct. You have to submit certain documents: a copy of the marriage license, a copy of the divorce decree, and a copy of the Catholic party's baptismal certificate. And once we have all that, we take a look, and the person had to be Catholic at the time. If the person got married outside of the church when the person wasn't Catholic, that's a valid marriage. So that we have to. That's why we look at the dates, make sure everything is in order. We ask those questions, and on the back it gives you explanatory notes. So it's pretty straightforward. But this usually is done by the pastor, the priest or deacon at your parish. But like I say, he may ask you to do that. And so it's good that you have this. And if you have any questions, call the tribunal. And so what we do once we have this information is we check to see if the marriage was ever convalidated, validated in the church after. So if a Catholic marries a non-Catholic in a civil ceremony, that's invalid. But a year later, they go to the church and want to be married in the church, and it's validated, it becomes valid at that time. And so if they don't give you that information, you might think that the marriage is invalid. So we check with the churches around where they live to make sure that it wasn't validated after the fact. And we have a database in the tribunal for every dispensation that we grant, so we can look that up on the computer. Okay? So that's important, and as I say, that's different than a full annulment. So a full, yeah.
I'm sorry. So are these, is there like a parish record where these are recorded, or are we just putting them in a file?
No,
Like
what
when
you
it comes back, so when
right.
it comes back, is it going
Well,
to
actually,
be
you give this to the
filed?
tribunal, you don't get this back. You get a letter back to say that the marriage has been declared null, and that you make a notation in the person's baptismal. If the person's in your parish, if the person's not, then we send it to the place of baptism.
Okay, so I'm probably keeping this the copy of what I send you in their baptismal.
Yeah, you
file?
can, but then you throw it away once it's done.
And then once it comes back, then we're making the notation in the baptismal record. Okay.
Right, and the same thing with a full annulment process. We send a record of that and a letter to the couple to keep, so that they can present that to a priest if they want to get married in the church. Then in your file there, I think you have a little question and answer about, marriage annulments, questions and answers. And again, this is on the website to give out to people who come and ask for it if you want to give that to them. And it's, again, pretty straightforward. Then there's something that's called the Pauline privilege, which I always have to ask questions when I get them because it can be a little confusing. But the basic premise of the Pauline privilege is if an unbaptized person who's been in a previous marriage now wants to become baptized, not even necessarily Catholic, but baptized, and marry a Catholic, we're able to dissolve that first marriage. Well, actually, the act of marrying the Catholic dissolves the first marriage. So it's a matter of paperwork being brought together, and submitted to us. And then we say, okay, the conditions for a Pauline privilege, and why we call it Pauline, because St. Paul talks about this. It's a marriage in favor of the faith, that you had two unbaptized people, one becomes baptized, and because of the animosity of the unbaptized, doesn't like the fact that this person got baptized, we're going to allow that person to be married to a Catholic. It's important that the other person hasn't gotten baptized, so it has to be two unbaptized people, and then one now wants to be baptized. If during that time the other person gets baptized, the Pauline privilege goes away. All right. And there's also something called the Petrine privilege for St. Peter, which has to do with the power or the authority of the Pope to dissolve certain marriages. He does not have the authority to dissolve a valid sacramental marriage, but certain marriages with unbaptized people, it's possible. But in reality, Rome prefers that we handle those as full annulment cases and not Petrine privileges, and it takes longer to send it to Rome than to do it here, and so we normally tell people, let's just go through our regular process, and we don't generally do the Petrine. But Pauline, we do on, if we have the right conditions. Two unbaptized, one now gets baptized and wants to marry a Catholic. So we do several of those a year, okay? So just so you know that that's there and that's available to you. And then what's not in your packet, and I apologize, we forgot to make copies of it, but just the guidelines on how to help people write up the story of their marriage for an annulment process. And these have been revised recently, and they're on the website in English and Spanish, and we've tried to simplify. We do not want a 20-page narrative. It should be typewritten, but 5 pages is plenty, just to give the basics. Then we are going to contact the person and ask questions in person, and ask for witnesses and things like that. But this gives really all of the things that you need to know. The important things to remember about this, or to tell the person applying, is that the former spouse has a right to see what they write about them. And so there's an awful lot of anger sometimes, and so you want to be careful not to put that in. We don't need that for the annulment, and that could be something they can give later. And most times the respondent does not come in to look at. We don't send a copy. If they want to see the acts of the case, which is the petitioner's petition and the testimony of any witnesses, they have to come into the tribunal and sit in an office or in a conference room with someone from the tribunal and look at the things. They can't take pictures, they can't take notes, and they can't take copies. So we don't send it, but some insist on seeing it, and it can cause even more acrimony for a person. So you want to tell people, don't spill all your anger out right now. Just tell us what happened and how you were feeling that day, or if you said anything to your best man or maid of honor that, I don't feel right about this, but I can't say no now, here we are, or anything, or so-and-so was drinking an awful lot before the wedding, and then it continued afterwards and it got unbearable. Or, I didn't know it at the time, but so-and-so was having an affair with 2 or 3 people before the wedding, and then afterwards, a year later, I find out another affair. And so those kinds of things, it's important for us to know. So-and-so said all the time, I'm never having children, I don't care what you say, or we're just not having children. So there's certain things, that make a marriage invalid right from the beginning. And so those are the things we want to see. But it's important to let them know, don't put anything in here that you wouldn't want your former spouse to see. Another question that arises oftentimes is that one or other, the petitioner doesn't want the respondent to be notified because they're afraid because of violence or something like that. And it's only in the rarest of cases that we don't. Rome insists that each party has a right to participate in the process and defend him or herself. And so we can't just say, well, because the person's been violent, that we can't notify him. We don't notify the person of where the petitioner is, although they can surmise, if it's from the Archdiocese of Washington, that the person lives in Washington or 5 counties of Maryland. But in very extreme cases, there's a possibility, if we protect the defendant's, the respondent's rights, that we could not notify them, but it's very rare. So it's something to talk to them about.
And what's typically in the notification?
We send a letter to say your former spouse has submitted the case to a Catholic tribunal, and we give a form now with 3 options. 1, thank you for telling me, I don't want to hear from you again. And we hope they check that and leave it, and we don't notify them. Second one, thank you for telling me, I don't want to be part of the process, but I want to know what the result is. The third one, thank you for telling me, I want to be part of the process, I want to hear everything, and they have a right to do that, and so then we follow up. But we give them that in the beginning, and hopefully most will check off 1 or 2. And then we proceed with the case. Okay. And if they want to be part of the process, they come in, we talk to them, and there's never, it's not like a courtroom where the petitioner and respondent are together. They're never together, and their witnesses are never together. We have the petitioner come in by him or herself, and their witnesses, we interview them separately, and then it all gets put together and given to the judge for determination.
If you notify the former spouse, what time period do you give them to respond back? Or if they don't respond back, then how do you fulfill that?
Right, there are time limits. I'm quite sure exactly, but maybe 15 days. I mean, there's a certain amount of time. And at the end, now the rules have been changed by Pope Francis. After a decision is made, the other party has 15 days to respond whether or not they want to appeal. And if they don't, then it's done. In the past, it automatically went on appeal to a second instance court here in the United States, or they had the option of bringing it right to Rome. So now it's much simplified. It doesn't take as long because we don't have to go through the appeals process. But some still do, a few, a handful.
So if they don't answer you at all, then it's still that 15 days.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the situation where an unbaptized non-Catholic did marry a Catholic, and then the unbaptized, well, they got divorced, and so now that unbaptized person wanted to come into the church.
That first marriage, was it in the church or was it outside?
I'm not sure.
That's key. If an unbaptized marries a Catholic by a justice of the peace, then it's a declaration of nullity. If they got married in the church, which they can, then it's a full annulment process. All right. All right, well, I think that's all I have with these forms, so we're going to open it up now for questions or comments, or we have a wonderful parish priest here who can tell us some of his experiences. Close enough. Soon to be. Parish priest. Yes, amen.
I've commented 2 situations where there's like 2 marriages involved. Like the first one that didn't get annulled, and then now they were improperly married a second time, and it's hard to encourage them to.
Right, but I'm glad you brought that up. Right. For non-Catholics, if there are 2 or 3 marriages, if the first one, we have to look at all 3. If the first one is declared invalid, that makes the second one valid. And so you have to go through all 3. For Catholics, after the first one, they've probably gotten married outside the church. So that's, we can declare them invalid right from the beginning and just look at the first one. But if the first one is invalid, then the second one is valid for non-Catholics. So we have to look at all of them. And we can do that all together. It's not 3 separate cases, it's all one case. But it takes longer, a little bit longer.
It's challenging to see them still
right.
at Mass. And
right. Yeah.
They don't fully understand. They came to you because they wanted to be a part of the church.
Right.
So they don't fully understand the ramifications of the situation, and you just hurt for them.
Exactly.
Because they don't realize,
Mm-hmm.
their marriage currently, is considered
Right.
you know.
And that's the thing, and that's why I started off by saying how important it is to be pastoral for people, because for them, that first marriage is gone. They do not consider themselves to be in that marriage. It's really by technicality that we do, because we haven't declared it null yet. And so it's difficult, it's very difficult to try to help them, encourage them to stay with us and to be part of the family, and let them know that they're part of the family. And we're going to work as much as we can to get them regularized. But that's painful. It's really heartbreaking. And you see people who, there was abuse in the first marriage. They had to get out of the first marriage, and now they're in a loving relationship, and it's life-giving and all kinds of things. And Pope Francis has spoken about this. He says we've got to work hard to make sure that we do as much as we can for these people. And so that's us, right? We're the ones who have to make sure we do all we can. And we are committed in the tribunal to being available and to making sure that we do all we can to help people so that they can come into the church, get married, and live full Christian lives. Yeah. Yes?
So I understand if an annulment is granted and the other party doesn't agree with it, they can ask for appeal. But if an annulment is not granted, then are there appeal rights?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, then the petitioner can appeal.
The petitioner can appeal,
Oh, yeah.
and those take, I'm guessing, a while.
No, not that much, because here, we hear the appeals from the Diocese of Cincinnati, and our appeals are sent to Cleveland. Because Cardinal Hickey arranged it that way because he was from Cleveland, and that's the way it is. So it doesn't take much longer. They don't go through a full process. They look at what we've done and make sure we did everything right. And if they think it's really grossly in error, they'll overturn. But most of the time they uphold. Then after that, they have another appeal to Rome if they want to. And that's more involved, and that would take longer.
And so does the tribunal or someone in the office help them through these appeals, or it's pretty much?
To the one in Cleveland, but into Rome, you're on your own. You have to get a canon lawyer who can go before the Roman Rota court, and they get paid full lawyer's fees, and so that kind of thing. Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say is the importance of getting a marriage certificate, because I've had people come in and insist they've only been married once before, and I'm like, bring me your marriage
Yeah.
certificate.
And it says
And
right
I
on
get
there,
it, it says
divorced.
divorced.
That's why we
Okay.
ask for these things.
So bring me the one before that, and it says divorced.
There
Like,
you go.
Can you bring me the one that says you're
Single.
divorced, and let's work through it.
Right, and that's why, again, we ask for documents, original documents. And people can get them if they want to. You can get a lot of this stuff online right now. You can request it from the court. But it's important, and again, I emphasize, it's so important to emphasize to people to let you know their marital status and whether they've ever been married before, even in a civil ceremony, because we want to make sure we take a look at that. All right. And yes?
If the priest is no longer in line with the Archdiocese guidelines, he is no longer,
The priest, you say?
is the priest, and he's no longer in line with the Archdiocese. He's outside the,
He's left ministry or has been?
he left the ministry, but he's still a priest. Can he solemnize marriage?
No. Well, if he's not a priest in good standing in a diocese or has the permission of another diocese, he cannot witness a marriage.
So it's not valid.
Right. Yeah.
That's what I call a winter priest.
Yeah, right. There are some who are, but yeah, if he's suspended by his own
Yes,
bishop,
and there's a suspension.
oh yeah, if he's suspended, then nobody would give him permission to do a marriage.
He will not ask permission, he just happened to be friends of those people. So he
Right,
has to
and so they think that they have a valid marriage, and that's really unfair. He's perpetrating a fraud on them, basically.
But how will you relate that to they saying that thou art a priest forever?
Well, you're still a priest, but you don't have the permission to do everything. That's the thing. So even if a priest has been dismissed from the clerical state, laicized as we call it, we still consider him a priest forever.
What if he repents and he wants to go back to the
He can, yeah, he can. I mean, with the permission, if it's just a suspension, the bishop can do that. If he's been dismissed, it has to go to Rome. And it's rare, but it happens.
And what about baptism? The same thing? He baptized.
Yeah, baptism is valid. It's illicit. He shouldn't be doing it. But it's valid. Because, again, the church wants people, and under certain circumstances, even a priest who's been laicized has the power to hear confession by the law. The law says that he can hear the confession of someone who asks him for it.
Unless
Again.
they take his faculties away.
Even if they do, sister, it's an odd thing. It's really for the purpose of the person going to confession, the confessor. It's to make sure that that person has the ability to go to whoever he or she asks. So the law makes an exception, because otherwise you have to have a faculty. Right. Yeah, well, but the person has to ask. He can't just go and sit in the confessional and have people come to him. That would not be right. But if somebody knows he's a former priest and says, I want you to hear my confession, he can hear it. And it's valid. And if he says Mass privately, he still has the power to confect the Eucharist, but that's illicit. It's against the law for him to do that.
So he can be committing a sacrilege, but the person receiving the sacrament is like somebody with a priest with mortal sin celebrating Mass.
Right.
The Mass is valid, but
Right.
he is.
Although in this case, he's
committing a
been,
sacrilege.
right, well, it wouldn't be a sacrilege because the law gave him the power to do it if the person asked him. Right, for the good of the person, if he comes and asks a priest who's been laicized to hear his confession, that's okay, and the priest is well within his rights to do it. If he holds himself out as a priest to hear confession, that's not good. That would be sacrilegious.
That's a difference.
That's a different, yeah.
But if they take his, if that is faculties away, you can't.
Well, I'm not only.
That's what happened
Right.
to.
Right, no, but I'm saying, this is not even just faculties. We're talking about someone who's been laicized, right? That's even more than taking the faculties away. And the law allows him to hear confession. I wouldn't lie to you, I promise. So, that's just the way the law is.
Well, the person receiving the sacrament, I can understand, but the
Right.
person doing what he's not supposed to be doing, he's.
Right, but the law says in this case, we're going to allow him to do it.
That law.
Yeah.
He has to face,
Right. No.
which is above.
Right, but I think there's a way to, it's really for the benefit of the person receiving the sacrament, we're going to allow this. That's what the church says. So, that's the way it
I
is.
seem to remember that being connected, like if somebody was imminently dying, there was no opportunity for a
Right.
priest, and the person said, can you hear? It was
Right.
for those type of rare situations.
Yeah, but the canon, it says,
You can go beyond.
yeah, it doesn't have to be in an emergency or danger of death.
Maybe the one being blessed is still valid, but the one giving the blessing is just a ministry or instrument
Right, right.
from God to the one who's being made to be healed.
Right. But I think it goes to your question, your thought that once you're ordained a priest, that can never be taken away unless the ordination was invalid. That's the only way. But just like baptism, once you're baptized, that there's an ontological change in the person, we believe, and so there's nothing that can take that away, even if somebody wants to deny it or leave the church. And I'm glad that brings me to the next one. Sometimes we get requests from Catholics to leave the church by a formal act, that they don't want nothing to do with the church anymore. And in the past, if somebody did that, they were not bound by the rules of marriage. Pope Benedict changed that. So if somebody does that now, we make a record of it and send it to the place of baptism, but they're still bound by the rules of marriage. And that makes a difference, obviously, if they want to go for an annulment later. So you might get people asking about it. But to leave by a formal act, you have to send a letter to the bishop saying, I want to leave the Catholic Church by a formal act. And then we notify the place of baptism to make a notation. It doesn't have as much effect as it used to because you're still bound by marriage. It might affect if your family wanted to have a burial, a funeral, but I think they would still probably do that. But that's something there. It happens. So. Good. All right. Well, is there any? I know it's a lot of, and it's very dry. I know. I'm sorry. There's a lot, but at least now I guess the point is to at least make you aware of the issues. You don't have to remember everything. If you say, I know that if it's an unbaptized, this, call the office and we'll try to work you through it. Right. Exactly. For baptisms, what baptisms are valid, which ones the church considers valid, which ones we don't consider valid. The Orthodox and the Christian churches of the East, those kinds of things. It's important.
And you have to go to your parish, or you can go straight to the Archdiocese?
You can go straight to the Archdiocese. You mean for an annulment or for any question?
Yeah, for annulment.
Yeah, for an annulment, it's good. We normally ask that you go through your pastor so he can give you these forms and the information, but someone can go online and get everything and send it right to the diocese. Yeah.
Isn't correct? I mean, because a lot of times it's a stigma behind, oh no, I don't want to go back and dig up all this bad blood and stuff like that. Would it be recommended to maybe just say, just fill it out, just write your story. You don't have to send it right now, but just, I don't know. Like,
Absolutely.
Encourage people to do
Yes,
the
and
stigma
you can, and I'll let them know that many people who have gone through the annulment process, and maybe you can even put them in touch with someone who's gone through the process in the parish, they say it's very cathartic, that something they didn't want to do, but once they finally sat down and wrote out the story, they really felt a burden lifted from them, that it was now outside of them. It wasn't something they were holding inside. So it's, I think it can be a good thing. It can also be horrible, and so you have to be sensitive to that. But maybe putting them in touch with someone who's gone through the process would be helpful.
So, Monsignor, if the parents of the child is married, right? They're not married, okay, in church or any form of our Catholic, but their child is already been baptized. I don't know why, but and then can they have communion or confirmation? Or
The child?
Yes.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah.
Even though the parents are not.
No, because you don't visit the sins of the parents onto the child. Yeah. So if an unmarried couple comes to you and wants the child baptized, you want to make sure that they can bring the child up in the faith, but you definitely baptize. And of course, that's the same nowadays with same-sex couples. We have 2 women and 2 men who are married civilly, legally. We don't acknowledge that marriage, but if they have children they bring to the church, we baptize those children if they are going to bring them up in the church. Yes, that's right. Now, and they can have other godparents, because parents can't be godparents, right? But they can have godparents, other people, and we want to encourage them. I mean, if they want to bring their children up in the church. And baptism is essential for our salvation. So we don't want to block the child because of what the parents have done. So it's a whole new world right now.
You mentioned something earlier when we were first going through the packet. We had an Anglican come through RCIA and for confirmation. But I didn't realize we were going to different. I didn't realize you mentioned something about if they already received Eucharist.
Right, that would be for the Orthodox, because we consider their sacraments valid. So if they wanted to come in, if they've received all 3 as an infant, then you would not reconfirm. But if someone's been confirmed in the Anglican Church, we confirm because we don't consider that a valid confirmation, because we don't consider their same thing. We don't consider their ministers to be able to confect valid sacraments, except for baptism, because it's the entryway. So anybody can baptize in an emergency.
So that is Anglican?
Anglican?
Or Orthodox?
Now, Orthodox is that we acknowledge their sacraments. We consider their sacraments valid. So their priests are valid priests who can confect the Eucharist. And we allow Catholics, if they're in a situation where they can't go to a Catholic Church, we can receive from the Orthodox, but often the Orthodox don't want us to receive from their churches, as we don't allow non-Catholic Christians, Protestants, to receive from us. We would admit Orthodox to our sacraments.
I had a friend who became an Antiochian Orthodox, and he up near Baltimore, and I said, "Can I come visit your church?" He says, "But you can't go to communion." He said, "My bishop would kill me."
Oh my, you don't want that, right? And the other thing with the Orthodox, if you receive them into the full communion of the Catholic Church, even if they come to your parish, Roman Catholic, they come into the corresponding Catholic Church that they're leaving. So if they're Ukrainian Orthodox and you bring them into RCIA, you can bring them in, but they become Ukrainian Catholics.
Oops.
And if they want to convert or change to Roman Catholic, that's a separate process.
Okay.
And there's no pressure to, if they can be.
Is there a process, my pastor said the act of having the child baptized in the Roman rite is the process. No? Oops.
No, the law has different things. It follows either if the father is Catholic, it follows what he is, and if the mother is, but by common agreement, they can agree to have it a different way. So we just have to make sure we know what they want for the child. But for them, for an adult coming into RCIA, if they're Orthodox, they come into the corresponding Catholic church that they're leaving from. It's very confusing.
Yes.
So, yes. So when you call in, I usually have to go and ask someone else, is this right? Is this what this is? Just to make sure.
And if someone cannot answer, you go to the cardinal.
Sure. Absolutely.
And then the Pope.
Yes. And they usually have to call and ask us because they may not know. So, good. Well, thank you all.